The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room. I stood in the kitchen staring at the coffee I had poured, untouched and growing cold. From the outside, everything looked pristine. Our home, our life, our marriage. But inside me, there was a restlessness I couldn't silence, a longing I couldn't explain. My husband was a good man. Reliable, hardworking, and steady as a rock. He loved me in his way, through gestures of care like fixing the leaky faucet last week or refueling my car without being asked. But there was something missing, something intangible yet deeply felt. I yearned for intimacy, for connection, for the spark that once ignited our lives but had long since dimmed. It was on such a day where my thoughts spiraled into silent dissatisfaction that he arrived. My husband's son from his first marriage. A fleeting presence in our home during holidays or occasional weekends, now a guest for the summer as he prepared for his next career step. He was young, confident, and carried himself with an air of nonchalance that made him seem untouchable. Yet beneath that exterior, there was an edge to him, a curiosity in his eyes that made me uneasy. The first moment I noticed him differently was entirely unexpected. I was folding laundry in the living room when he walked in, freshly showered, a towel slung casually over his shoulder. His hair was damp and he wore a simple white t-shirt that clung to his frame. He greeted me with a nod, his voice casual, almost indifferent as he asked, "Need help with that?" I shook my head quickly, averting my gaze as if the act of looking at him too long might reveal thoughts I couldn't afford to have. "I'm fine, thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. But as he moved past me, something lingered in the air, an unspoken tension I hadn't felt before. It wasn't what he said or did. It was the way the room seemed to shift around him, the way his presence felt too large for the space we shared. That evening, during dinner, I couldn't help but notice how he commanded attention without trying. His voice was calm but assured as he shared stories about his recent travels and future plans. My husband listened intently, proud of his son's ambition. I tried to focus on the conversation but my mind drifted, caught on the details. The way his hands moved as he spoke, the hint of a smirk that played at the corner of his lips when he made a witty remark. After dinner, as I cleaned the dishes, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the kitchen window. My thoughts felt foreign, unwelcome. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over me. This was absurd. He was my husband's son, a guest in our home. I pushed the thoughts away, determined not to let them resurface. But the next day they did. I was in the garden, tending to the roses when he came outside, phone in hand, deep in conversation. He didn't notice me at first, his voice low and serious as he discussed some work-related matter. When he hung up, he finally looked over, catching me mid-movement as I adjusted the garden hose. "Nice garden," he said, stepping closer. "You take care of it yourself?" I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I find it relaxing." He crouched down beside one of the rose bushes, his fingers lightly grazing a bloom. "Relaxing, huh? I don't have the patience for this kind of thing." "It's not about patience," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "It's about care. You have to nurture them, make sure they're not overwatered but not neglected either. It's a balance." He looked up at me then, his gaze steady, unreadable. "I guess you're good at that. Balancing things." The comment caught me off guard, though his tone seemed innocent enough. I felt a heat rise to my cheeks and quickly turned my attention back to the flowers. "It's nothing special," I said, brushing off his words. But his gaze lingered, and I felt it even as I avoided looking directly at him. The air between us was charged, heavy with something unspoken. I knew I should have walked away, ended the conversation, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. As the evening approached, I replayed the moment in my mind, dissecting every word, every glance. My husband was still at work and the house felt too big, too empty. I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would calm my nerves, but it only made my thoughts louder. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let it happen again. Whatever it was. Yet even as I made this silent vow, a small voice inside me whispered that it was already too late. The following morning started like any other, but I couldn't shake the weight of the previous day. His words, his presence, they lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't stop humming. I busied myself with mundane tasks, straightening the living room, folding laundry, watering the plants. Each chore was a desperate attempt to regain control over my thoughts, to drown out the growing unease that stirred within me. By the time I finished, the house was unusually quiet. My husband had left early for work, leaving me alone with him. I found him in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated his silhouette, highlighting the ease with which he carried himself. "Morning," he said, his voice steady, almost teasing. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, reaching for a glass of water. I avoided his eyes, but I could feel his gaze on me, sharp and curious. "You always this restless?" he asked, the corner of his mouth lifting into a faint smirk. "Not always," I said, forcing a laugh. "Just lately." The words escaped before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted their honesty. His expression shifted, his teasing demeanor softening into something closer to concern. "Lately, huh? Trouble in paradise." I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. "I didn't mean," I started, but he raised a hand, cutting me off. "Relax," he said, his tone lighter now. "I'm just messing with you." I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. "You have a strange sense of humor." "Maybe," he admitted, his smile returning. "But you don't seem like someone who laughs much these days." His words hit a nerve, and I turned to face him, suddenly defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just an observation." We stood there in silence, the air between us heavy and charged. I hated how easily he got under my skin, how effortlessly he unraveled me with a few simple words. And yet I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The moment passed and I forced myself to move, retreating to the living room with my glass of water. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, but I couldn't focus. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: guilt, anger, curiosity. I didn't understand why he affected me the way he did, but the harder I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Later that day, I decided to go for a run, hoping the physical exertion would clear my head. I laced up my sneakers and grabbed my headphones, determined to leave my thoughts behind. As I stepped outside, I heard his voice behind me. "Going somewhere?" he asked, leaning against the doorway with that same infuriating smirk. "For a run," I said, my tone curt. "Why?" "No reason," he said, shrugging. "Mind if I join?" I hesitated, my mind racing. Every part of me wanted to say no, to find an excuse to avoid him. But his gaze was steady, almost challenging, and I felt a strange pull to accept. "Suit yourself," I said finally, turning away. We ran in silence for the first mile, the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves filling the air. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing, on the steady beat of my heart, but I was acutely aware of his presence beside me. "You're fast," he said, eventually breaking the silence. "Didn't think you had it in you." "Why?" I asked, glancing at him. "Because I don't fit your idea of someone who works out?" "Not at all," he said, his tone genuine. "You just surprised me, that's all." We reached a small park and I slowed to a stop, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. He stopped beside me, his breathing steady despite the distance we'd covered. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet of the park enveloping us. "You're full of surprises," he said finally, his voice softer now. "So are you," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He stepped closer and I felt my heart quicken, the space between us suddenly too small. His gaze met mine, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. I knew I should step back, break the tension before it consumed us, but I couldn't move. And then it happened. A moment of weakness, of surrender. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, as if testing the boundaries. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The world around us faded, and all I could feel was the heat of his touch, the electricity that surged through me. When he pulled back, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of regret and longing. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to find the words. I didn't know what I felt: guilt, shame, desire. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of what had happened. The kiss replayed in my mind on an endless loop. His touch, the way the world seemed to pause, and the sharp pang of guilt that followed. I told myself it was a moment of madness, an impulse that would never repeat itself. But deep down I knew the truth. A line had been crossed and there was no going back. I avoided him as much as I could for the next few days. I busied myself with chores, errands, anything to keep myself occupied and out of the house. When we did cross paths, I kept our conversations short, refusing to meet his eyes for more than a fleeting second. He seemed to sense my unease and didn't press the issue, though I often caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. The tension between us was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the weight of my own thoughts. I couldn't escape the questions that plagued me. What did that kiss mean? Why hadn't I stopped it? And most importantly, what was I going to do now? It wasn't until the weekend that the silence between us finally broke. My husband suggested a day trip to the coast, a chance to unwind and spend some time together as a family. He had been so preoccupied with work lately that he barely noticed the growing distance between us, and I couldn't bring myself to refuse. Maybe the change of scenery would help clear my mind. The drive to the coast was uneventful, though I could feel the unspoken tension in the car. My husband was focused on the road, humming along to the radio, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window while he sat in the back, his presence a constant reminder of what had happened. When we arrived, the beach was quiet, the sky overcast but not threatening rain. My husband set up a small picnic area while I wandered toward the shoreline, needing a moment to myself. The cool breeze off the water was refreshing, and for the first time in days I felt like I could breathe. "You always drift off on your own like this?" His voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing a few feet away, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He looked at me with that same steady gaze, the one that seemed to see right through me. "I just needed some air," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me." I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "I've been busy." "Is that what we're calling it now?" he asked, his tone laced with irony. "Busy." I turned away, my eyes fixed on the horizon. "This isn't the time or place for this conversation." "Then when?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. "Because I can't pretend like nothing happened, and I don't think you can either." I felt my chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right, of course. Pretending was futile, but admitting the truth was even more terrifying. "I don't know what you want me to say," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened." "Maybe," he said, taking another step closer. "But it did. And pretending it didn't isn't going to change that." I turned to face him, my eyes meeting his. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that I hadn't seen before, a crack in the confident facade he usually wore. It made him seem human in a way that unnerved me. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's wrong." "Why?" he asked, his tone soft but unrelenting. "Because someone decided it's wrong? Because it doesn't fit into the neat little box of what life is supposed to be? Because it will destroy everything," I said, my voice breaking. "Everything I've built, everything I have. It'll all come crashing down." He didn't respond right away, his eyes searching mine as if looking for answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. "Maybe it's already falling apart." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I turned away, unable to face him any longer. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not now. We should get back," I said, my voice hollow. "They'll wonder where we are." He didn't argue, didn't try to stop me as I walked away. But I felt his gaze on my back the entire way, a reminder that no matter how far I tried to run, the weight of what had happened would always follow me. By the time we returned home that evening, the exhaustion in my body was matched only by the turmoil in my mind. My husband, oblivious to the tension that had followed us like a shadow all day, seemed content as he carried the cooler inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. "Good day, wasn't it?" he said with a satisfied smile. I nodded absently, muttering something about needing a shower before heading upstairs. The bathroom became my refuge, the sound of water masking the racing of my thoughts. I leaned against the cool tiles, letting the steam envelope me. Every word, every glance from earlier replayed itself in my mind. I hated how much I had allowed his presence to affect me, hated even more that I had no idea how to stop it. The next day, life seemed to settle into its usual rhythm, or at least that's how it appeared on the surface. My husband was back at work, and I threw myself into household routines with a determination that bordered on desperation. I told myself that if I stayed busy enough, I could keep the thoughts at bay. But as the days passed, it became clear that I wasn't the only one who had noticed the subtle shifts in our home. Our neighbor, a kind but nosy woman who lived 2 houses down, had always taken an interest in our lives. Her visits were sporadic but persistent, usually accompanied by a plate of cookies or a pot of homemade jam. That afternoon she showed up unannounced, her sharp eyes scanning me as I opened the door. "Just thought I'd pop by and see how you're doing," she said brightly, stepping inside before I could invite her. She set a small tin of cookies on the counter, her gaze lingering on the living room where he sat with his laptop. "Everything's fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for these though. You're too kind." She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, it's nothing. You know me, I like keeping busy." Her eyes darted back toward the living room and she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "It must be nice having a bit of extra company these days." I froze for half a second before recovering. "It is. He's very independent though. Keeps to himself most of the time." Her smile widened, but there was something behind it, an almost predatory curiosity. "Well, I couldn't help but notice how attentive he seems to be. It's sweet really." I felt my pulse quicken, a sharp pang of unease settling in my stomach. "He's just being polite," I said lightly, brushing off her comment. "It's how he was raised." "Of course," she said, her tone dripping with false innocence. "Still, you might want to be careful. Boys his age can be impulsive." The implication in her words hung heavy in the air and I forced myself to laugh. "He's a grown man, not a boy. But thanks for the advice." She stayed a little longer, making idle conversation about her garden and the latest neighborhood gossip, but my mind was elsewhere. By the time she left, I felt drained, the weight of her insinuations pressing down on me. Later that evening, I found myself in the kitchen, preparing dinner while my husband worked late yet again. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of footsteps upstairs. I tried to focus on the task at hand, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, but my thoughts kept drifting. When he appeared in the doorway, I startled slightly, nearly dropping the knife. He leaned against the frame, watching me with an expression that was impossible to read. "Long day?" he asked, his voice low. "You could say that," I replied, turning back to the cutting board. "Your neighbor stopped by earlier." "She always does," he said with a shrug. "What did she want this time?" "Just to chat," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "You know how she is." He didn't respond right away, and when I finally looked up, I saw that his gaze had softened. "You seem tense," he said quietly. "I'm fine," I said, turning back to the cutting board. "Just tired." "You don't look fine." I clenched the knife tighter, willing myself to stay calm. "I said I'm fine." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed a hand on my wrist, stopping me mid-chop. The contact sent a jolt through me and I looked up, meeting his eyes. "Stop pretending," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We both know you're not fine." I pulled my hand away, breaking the contact. "You don't know anything." "Don't I?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Because it feels like I do." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The tension between us was suffocating, and I could feel my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "We shouldn't," I started, but he cut me off. "But we are," he said, his tone firm. "And pretending it's not happening isn't going to make it go away." I shook my head, turning away from him. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us. There's more at stake." "I understand more than you think," he said. "And I'm not going anywhere." I didn't respond, couldn't respond. The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time, I realized just how deep I had allowed myself to sink. The silence in the house that evening was almost unbearable. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than usual. Every shadow cast by the dim kitchen light felt longer and darker. I stood by the window, gazing out into the night, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. The words he had said earlier replayed in my mind, each one piercing through the fragile barrier I had tried so hard to build. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. I wasn't fine. And pretending that I was only made the cracks more visible. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. They were deliberate, measured, as if he knew that each step brought him closer to a line that shouldn't be crossed. When he appeared in the doorway, I didn't turn to face him. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was terrified that if I looked at him, he'd see everything I was trying to hide. "You're doing it again," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that made it impossible to ignore. "Pretending." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," he said, stepping closer. "For once, just say what you're really thinking." I turned to face him then, unable to hold back any longer. You think this is easy for me? I asked, my voice rising slightly. You think I don't know how wrong this is? How dangerous? I don't think it's wrong, he said, his voice steady. I think it's real. His words hung in the air between us, daring me to challenge them. I wanted to argue, to push him away, to tell him that he was wrong. But the truth was I couldn't. Because deep down I felt it too. You don't understand, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. This will destroy everything. Maybe everything needs to be destroyed, he said, his tone soft but unyielding. Maybe that's the only way to start over. I shook my head, stepping back. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? He asked, stepping closer. Because it feels like I'm the only one willing to be honest about what's happening here. I couldn't respond. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, guilt, desire. I hated him for pushing me, for making me confront feelings I had buried for so long. But I also hated myself for wanting him to. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through my body that I couldn't ignore. I should have pulled away, should have walked out of the room, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped between what I knew was right and what I wanted. I can't. I started, but the words died in my throat as he leaned in closer. His breath was warm against my skin, and I could feel the tension between us building to a breaking point. You can, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You just won't. And then it happened. His lips found mine, not tentative this time, but with a certainty that left no room for doubt. It was a kiss that demanded to be felt, to be remembered. My resolve crumbled, and for a moment I allowed myself to surrender. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a tidal wave. I stepped back, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. This can't happen again, I said, my voice shaky. It already has, he said, his gaze locked on mine. And it will again. I didn't have an answer, didn't have the strength to argue. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the dimly lit kitchen. My mind was a mess, my emotions a storm I couldn't control. I knew I had just crossed a line I could never uncross, and the weight of that realization threatened to crush me. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his lips had felt against mine. And for the first time I didn't try to push the thoughts away. The days that followed were a blur of half-finished conversations and stolen glances. Each time I resolved to set boundaries, I found myself undermining my own decisions, pulled back into the magnetic tension that had begun to dominate my every thought. I avoided being alone with him, but the moments we shared, however brief, felt like they stretched into eternity. One evening after dinner, I found myself walking past his room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the soft glow of the computer screen spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated, unsure if I should disturb him, but curiosity won out. I knocked lightly, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. He was sitting at his desk, headphones on, completely absorbed in whatever was on the screen. I stepped in, intending only to check on him to see if he was staying on top of his tasks. But as I moved closer, I noticed what was on the monitor. Something unfamiliar yet oddly intriguing. The screen was filled with intricate mathematical equations and shifting graphs, the kind of thing I hadn't seen since college. He didn't even notice me at first, so deeply was he immersed in his work. Or was it a game? I couldn't quite tell. Shouldn't you be focusing on your assignments? I asked gently, leaning against the doorframe. He startled, pulling off his headphones and spinning around to face me. I was taking a break, he said, his tone defensive but not entirely convincing. This is just something I've been working on. I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued. What is it? I asked, gesturing toward the screen. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. It's nothing really. Just an algorithm I've been messing with. Helps optimize stuff. I raised an eyebrow, impressed despite myself. That doesn't sound like nothing. It sounds complicated. He shrugged again, his expression softening. It's just a hobby. Something to keep my mind busy. I studied him for a moment, noting the faint traces of frustration in his eyes. He looked different somehow. Less composed, less confident than usual. It was a glimpse of vulnerability I hadn't seen before, and it caught me off guard. Well, I said, finally breaking the silence, if you need help you can always ask. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Help? He repeated as if the word was foreign to him. Yes, help, I said, smiling faintly. You don't always have to do everything on your own, you know. He stared at me for a long moment and I felt a flicker of something. Gratitude, perhaps? Or maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, the tension in the room seemed to shift, becoming something softer, more subdued. Thanks, he said finally, his voice quiet. I nodded, taking a step back toward the door. Just, don't forget to finish your assignments, okay? He smirked, the familiar confidence returning to his expression. Yes, ma'am. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling as I turned to leave. As I stepped out into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed a side of him I wasn't meant to see. A side that made it even harder to maintain the distance I so desperately needed. Later that night as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying the encounter in my mind. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to let his guard down, that lingered. It wasn't just the kiss that had blurred the lines between us. It was moments like this. Quiet, unassuming but deeply personal. Moments that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself and the boundaries I had always taken for granted. The house was quiet but my mind was anything but. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning in circles. I knew I was in too deep, but the more I tried to pull away, the more entangled I became. The morning came slowly, each passing minute heavier than the last. I woke before the sun, the pale light of dawn creeping through the curtains, illuminating the bedroom in a muted haze. My husband lay beside me, still asleep, his breathing deep and even. I envied his peace, his ability to drift through life with such certainty, while I felt as though I were standing on the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from falling into the abyss. I spent the day avoiding him, the one person I knew I shouldn't think about but couldn't seem to escape. Every time I heard his footsteps, I found a reason to leave the room. Every glance he cast my way felt like a question I couldn't answer. But avoiding him only made the silence louder, the tension more unbearable. By evening, the weight of it all became too much. I found myself pacing the kitchen, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. The house was unusually quiet. My husband was working late again and I was alone with my thoughts. Alone except for him. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the familiar sound sending a shiver down my spine. He entered the kitchen quietly, his presence filling the room in a way that felt suffocating. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. We need to talk, I said, my voice firm despite the knot in my throat. He nodded, his expression serious. I know. I gestured toward the table and we both sat down, the space between us feeling impossibly small despite the physical distance. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said, the unspoken truths that had been building between us for weeks. I don't know how to do this, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to make this stop. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on mine. Maybe it doesn't have to stop. I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of the table. You don't understand. This isn't just about us. This is my life. My marriage. And are you happy? He asked, his tone quiet but insistent. Can you honestly tell me that you're happy? His words hit me like a punch to the gut and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for a long time. That doesn't matter, I said finally, my voice shaking. What matters is doing the right thing. And what if this is the right thing? He asked, his voice softer now. What if this is what you've been looking for all along? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do, he said, his tone firm. I know exactly what I'm saying. And I think you do too. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around me. I wanted to run, to escape the weight of his words, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped between what I knew was right and what I wanted. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice breaking. I can't. He reached out then, his hand covering mine. The contact was warm, steady, and for a moment, it felt like the only solid thing in a world that had become unrecognizable. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said, his voice gentle. Just, don't shut me out. Please. I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. I need some air. Before he could respond, I left the kitchen, stepping out into the cool night. The air was crisp, the stars scattered across the sky like fragments of glass. I stood there, breathing deeply, trying to quiet the storm inside me. I didn't know how long I stood there before I heard the door open behind me. He stepped outside, his presence a quiet but undeniable force. "You can't keep running," he said softly. I turned to face him, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to be this person." "You're not alone," he said, his gaze steady. "You don't have to face this alone." His words broke something inside me, the walls I had spent so long building crumbling to dust. I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't try to stop them. For the first time I let myself feel everything. The fear, the guilt, the longing. "I'm scared," I whispered, the admission feeling like a weight lifted from my chest. "So am I," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "But we'll figure it out. Together." I didn't know what the future held or how we would navigate the tangled mess we had created. But in that moment, under the starlit sky, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward.